Here's another one. This is O Fortuna Sandy Spins. This takes data sets from 2 locations, New Jersey and New York. You can read the data off of these pieces to find out what the weather was like during Hurricane Sandy, but it's also riding on a raft. Everything is related to boats. So is this how, is this what Coney Island's going to look like in the future? And then in the back, you can spin this wheel of fortune to find out how many houses are going to be underwater, depending on how high the sea level rises.
This was the original presentation, which happened at Astor Place in Cooper Union on a Saturday night in the East Village. My involvement with Electric Blanket at its inception was always the design. I thought about where to do it, how to stage it, I had a technical director that I had worked with in theater who worked with me to sort of make it happen.
So the last piece that I'm going to talk about in the self-made group is the cycle of self-determination. And this piece was completed in 2018. That's me performing on it in a gallery performance at Vox Populi that same year. And what is it? It is a fully functional, sculptural, bicycle-powered woodworking lathe. I activated it in durational gallery performances, usually about 2 hours long. And what this piece was about is really like this question, going back to that original question, what will I become if I do these projects in the Boy Mechanic? At this point, I was 10 years older than when I had started the Boy Mechanic project. The world had changed a lot politically. I had changed, my life had changed. And I really was kind of really thinking like, well, what did happen? What did I become? What happens if you follow through on this sort of promise, even in an absurd way, of this idea of self-reliance? Who does the Boy Mechanic become? Does he become a captain of industry, as is kind of promised, or does he become a cog in the machine?
This painting, it's a pretty large painting. De Kooning made this painting when he was 46. Now that I'm 43, it's important to think about. It's interesting because this is sort of like, this is one of his major paintings. He was 46 when he made this. But really, when you think about de Kooning, the woman paintings come right after this. And then what we would consider his main style comes after that. So really, like, de Kooning is in his 50s before he starts making what we think of as de Kooning paintings, mature de Kooning paintings. And this painting has like a few different things that stand out to me. One is this sort of churning motion, this like circular motion of this folded space that if you really look at it, it really starts to either like sort of pop out or sort of like zoom in. It has this really interesting play of space. And that's one of the most engaging things for me about paintings, is the spatial reality in painting and that sort of experience of space in painting. I always imagine myself sort of like entering that space or like shrinking down and exploring that space.
Again, I wanted to bring in this notion of a cart, bring the viewer into, I designed the cart to be a very rigid, like 90-degree posture, kind of like the astronauts who were confined in the Apollo capsule. And I wanted this kind of really weird body-like reference to that experience. So in this piece, the viewer pulls themselves into this sort of box on this cart. So you pull yourself into this experience and up into this niche that's dark, but the darkness kind of gives way to this window that goes off into this sort of like Stranger Things biolab. And at the same time, there's an audio track inside the piece that is, it's the hypnotic regression of Barney Hill, one of the first alien abductees.
They're meant to be full wall projections and light boxes as you walk with me. And again, there are parameters, coordinates, date, time, how many paces stepped, quite arbitrary depending on the specific location before taking a photograph, and cause of death. And its purpose for me was one of contemplation.
last but not least, and perhaps the most important part of all of this, is to maintain a commitment to making work. The level of production that we maintain during graduate education is pretty astounding. It's very impressive. And we don't have the luxury of saying, hey, I'm going to move the deadline, I'm going to push it another week. We simply have to make it happen. But we all have very different ways of producing. I'm one of those people who thinks about something for maybe 3-4 months before he even picks up a camera or picks up a notebook to write about it. So it's okay to be you, but it doesn't mean that you don't maintain a commitment to show up to work. If you have a studio space, you show up and you go there and you do research there. Whatever it is that you have, this little corner of the world, again, it could be the corner of your bedroom, but make it a practice to show up to work and to make.
There's Victoria Santa Cruz, who is really, these again were performances that were kind of these radical performances. This is just where people were shouting back and forth to one another that were documented. And this is Johanna Harmon, Barrigas. And these are really kind of these body molds of her pregnant stomach in some ways. So again, like, you know, we were seeing a lot of, like, at this time, this is 1979, you know, a lot of like really coming out of minimalism, you know, in the 60s and early 70s. And this was really, again, a response to this in a much more kind of, you know, feminist way.
How many of you are doing like exhibition mock-ups in terms of, you know, kind of, you know, doing designs of what your work would look like in an exhibition space, like visualization work? A little bit, anybody?
I have, but I'm not doing it now.
So you know, one of the things, I mean, it's gotten a lot easier to do. There are, I mean, I remember doing this ages ago in Photoshop because I just used to do everything in Photoshop. But, you know, being able to, you know, as you're presenting your ideas, I think it's great to, you know, we all have our websites and we all have, you know, in some cases, like, you know, multiple websites. But the idea of being able to kind of show somebody what this would look like, either in like, you know, as in a gallery, out on, you know, on the street as a public sculpture or public artwork, in an airport, you know, lobby through a public art project, or through, you know, even in somebody's house, right? Like, I mean,
Dust Storm combines Jones's forte, wheat threshing, with a terrifying dust storm rolling over the horizon. Unlike in the Anthony mural, the farmer here is alone, harvesting the wheat with a thresher, an older mode of harvest than the modern combine in the mural. The evidence of this farmer's hard work is also visible in the lines of cut wheat and the crop gathered in shock, but that work is under immediate threat from the rolling wall of soil. Jones makes great use of his medium, allowing the tendrils of ink to escape the outline of the dirt cloud, giving the storm a texture and vibrant tactility. Dust Storm is a terrifying vision of the devastation that Plains farmers lived with throughout the 1930s.
The limitation of that is that people will be less likely to sort of focus on any individual photo, and will be less likely to think about these as, you know, perhaps like a work of art that is, you know, incredibly ambitious, and more likely to think about it as something that is almost diaristic or journalistic instead, right? It might slip more into the mode of sort of documentation or photojournalism in some way. So, and that's not a bad thing, right? It's just, I just want you to be thinking in a very deliberate way about your presentation format, because I think it'll really change how people respond to these images.
This is your research. This is the work that you do in your mind to make the work. Like, these are all the things that inform what you're doing. But I think there's a different relationship to the artifact in that I don't care. I'm not that I don't care, because I, you know, whenever you say stuff like this, I'm like, wow, that's wild. but like, I just care about the images that come from all of this. And it all came from the same person who was interested in plastic spoons and was a writer and all those things. And like, this is where the work comes from. And it's really interesting, but the work to me feels very separate from all of from these narratives that you're telling yourself and these narratives that you're exploring.
But I also wanted to talk about the potency of the images you were talking about earlier, that it seems to be passive, right? That you're looking at artwork as a kind of passive thing. But in actuality, there's an enormous amount of artwork historically that have created phenomenal political waves, right? You know, moral, ethically, you know, political. It's like that there still is a potency in the image as well.
I mean, sort of. I think that has changed. I think that
I think it's changed, but it doesn't mean that this is necessarily just passive, right?
I don't know.
In my mind, I might be completely wrong, but
I don't know that pastel or painting is going to change anyone's mind about a lot of things in this day and age. And I don't think that that's not to recommend it. Like, we all are practitioners of this, but I don't think that that is going to light the world on fire. I just don't think people would ever see it, honestly.
And then you could throw Berger into it and say, no one's really seeing the painting. You know, we're seeing the photo of the painting. So then is it the painting that's powerful? Or is the image, or is the facsimile of the painting? You know?
Right. Well, that's how we're experiencing all of this.
Yeah, it's not a painting.
And then that's not even a photo too, because no, it's not deep. And then I'm thinking about it too, like, it's not even the photo, because the photo by itself without context would be irrelevant. Nobody would care. But because it's affixed to Time magazine, then it means something. It's not even the artist or the image, it's just where it's put. So it's just context, you know.
Well, we've successfully
Is nobody going to quote Benjamin here?
Well, I'm glad we successfully argued against painting now. Our work is done.
I don't think there's any reason to
cheers. Let's go for drinks after.
If you want to make paintings that are just of fabric, they are going to, whether you like it or not, become paintings about paintings. That is what they will be. That is how they will be read by your audience.
You use the word domesticity a lot when you talked about your original work, but I don't actually have the feeling of anything domestic in these.
Okay.
It doesn't actually, to me, speak about domesticity, because if you were making paintings of your son doing things like playing or doing the dishes or, you know, petting the dog, but you don't, right? So it's always in a passive stance. He's always in a passive stance. It becomes sort of slightly voyeuristic in the way that you're treating the subject matter.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, it's like he's dead all the time. I mean, no offense, but it's like, yeah, they're kind of, it's like, it's always your perspective standing over him, watching him be asleep. I mean, it's creepy to have someone watch you sleep.
It's a good thing that there is a response, and rather than, because it's our immediate response is to get a little defensive, because this is not my intention. This is not what I was after. This is fine. You know, this is fine. And this is how progress is being created, you know. But it's not a bad thing that some people see things that you did not intend to or did not think about, you know. It's better that people have some sort of an opinion and a response rather than, I just don't understand anything you do. And that goes back, I'm sorry that it feels like maybe I'm piggyback on things you said, but I think that this is the way to understand our work the best and our motivations, you know, when we actually say things, whether it's very intentional or by the way, like what I picked up about that you wish not to have a client, not someone telling you to be happy with this picture. Do I like myself, how I look like, or I don't like, right? You also mentioned that you work with different formats and with digital and with medium format and 35. And then you said, if anyone cares, right? Do you care?
I totally care. I feel like I maybe care too.
Why is it important? Why is it important, the tool that you are mixing around with?
Why is it important to me that I'm mixing different types of...
Why is it important for your practice, or for me reading the photographs, knowing that you're using Tri-X, or whether you're using Portra, or whether you're actually using you know, a digital Canon camera? Why is it important for me to know?
Yeah, I thought about this question a lot after the past couple of critiques where you were talking about like what medium are we using and like that should matter. I feel like I talk a lot about like whether or not something is film or digital, because the process for me, whether or not it's film or digital, really influences like how I'm taking the photo and how I'm experiencing that moment. Because I shoot digital so much in my professional life, like as a wedding photographer, I only shoot a little bit of film. Like shooting film, particularly like 35 millimeter, just really allows me to it's like to be more present in the work that I'm making, but also not to be so distracted by like getting the exact perfect image. So
I'm not convinced that that matters in any of this. You know, I keep going back to the idea that you're using tools, and you know, whether or not you recorded it with film or digitally isn't going to impact my experience of the picture. And I think I'm not sure that I can record a whole bunch of pictures digitally, put them in Lightroom, and I can apply a filter that gives it the look of film, and nobody will ever know the difference, right? So I'm not convinced that this is I think you have to get over it, is what I would say, is this idea of the preciousness of the tool, unless it somehow is really, really important in your process or the end result. Right.
Yeah, it's just a quick question. I was just wondering, like, because it's set up like a triptych. Is it a triptych? Should we read them as one, the three images as one, or?
So a lot of the reason the images are placed the way that they are is just because I see that they correlate and have a similarity.
I mean, I really like the format. It's kind of giving me an honest, like a very simple narrative that I can like dive off into. But then each one is singularly a little different, but it feels like it's moving in a kind of sequential way.
It looked like you talked about blue in a very conceptual way. You know what I mean? You made the connection to blues, and then Lars put Yves Klein blue, and we talked about different. Now, my question is, what's the importance of photography in this blue? Why do you feel need, and why those plants and not, you know, lamps? And you know, because if we are going after blue as a concept, it could be videos, it could be just the color blue, it could be everything that you will go through Photoshop and just put the blue filter on. You know, every picture that you take with your phone can become blue, just like those cyanotypes. And what is your relationship to the actual medium? Like cyanotype, because they're blue, you start working with them? Because you're going through a lot of process. You're making internegatives, right? You're taking your digital pictures or whatever pictures, you have to make larger negatives from them that are digital, I assume. And then you expose, and all this basically steps that if you're just interested in the word or the concept or the color blue are a little unnecessary.
I agree very much with Yoav. There's a disconnect at this point between what you're talking about in terms of the how you're understanding them and the imagery themselves and the process. And you and I talked about at one point, I was her academic advisor.
Well, what I mean by these two pair, you know, these two photographs that are obviously made very differently. We know that they are made in succession, right? Meaning one after another, whether it's one and then 8, but it doesn't matter. It's the same time. But what happens actually between them, and I want you to maybe think about that, is that the left one, she feels more of doing whatever you want. And on the right, it feels like she's taking charge over the photograph and becomes like a model. and doing like a certain pose. The other thing that's really interesting for me is that the open sign, the open light is on the right and it's not on the left. And it looks, you know, and we can see the rust in the store, and we can see that the sidewalk is broken, and we know that it's not a fancy place. And something about her taking charge over this scene and trying to make it like high fashion almost, you know what I mean? By striking a pose and the fact that you're getting closer to her. There is something I think very empowering, which is very close to what you mentioned earlier about Jamel Shabazz. You know, and I think that Jamel was doing that since the 80s very well, about common people or middle class or lower class or people that are not, you know, famous, and how they take charge over the photograph and how they actually present themselves, which happens, I think, very much Shabazi on the right and very much about the place on the left.
To me, it actually looks more like the casual photo. She's like, this is me in my place. And then it's like, I mean, she might well have chose that pose for herself, but there's so much that goes into a woman choosing that pose in these photos that come from other places that may not be internal, but they also may be. I'm not saying that it's an unfeminist thing to do to pose that way. Like, I'm not saying any of that. She can choose whatever she wants, but a lot of these things are foisted upon us by media images. This is essentially also a media image. So I just think that's sort of an interesting self-referential thing. Like, how
I think everyone who's spoken, Andre and Eileen and Lars, in terms of, you have got to show us everything, or find a way to edit carefully enough, but still show us everything in a way that shows.
It also
your
can't
process.
be like grandpa's boring beach vacation.
No, it can't. I mean, that's going to be your issue.
But I also think that by being a good curator of your process, meaning what to extract and what to show and what to share, okay, you can give what we call reasons or understanding of reasonings. For instance, I kept asking myself, why do you use drawings and watercolors, but you never present them as watercolors and drawings? You present scans that are overlaid digitally.
I do think this is something we've talked about before, John, is there still for me seems to be a degree of arbitrariness in some of these processes. And I think there was a little bit of, I think maybe you was implying that as well with some of the things he was saying, but I still don't understand why some of these, why they, you know, how do we get to a sound piece with it? Or, you know, why do we need to go through all these steps to get to there? Just make a sound piece.
It's like, why am I choosing this over this? Because there are these billions of, you know, of choices that you're making. And I think that's kind of what Christopher maybe is talking about as well, right? That sort of maybe lack of specificity that sometimes is felt here, that it seems to be kind of too wide in scope, right? And we need to maybe funnel it down into some more, I think maybe simpler forms.
But less directed. It's more, like you said, millions of yes, no questions.
Yeah, or maybe it's
of,
going the other way. Maybe it's just like the millions of, right?
Yeah, I actually disagree with these points, because I think the joy in your work is the lunacy of the sound piece and the line drawing and the watercolor, because that feels very specific to you.
It sort of concerns me that, you know, it's like, it's sort of almost like you're skating over, you know, the surfaces, and none of this is actually, you haven't really dipped much deeper into any of these things.
Are you framing it in the way that you want to, or are you framing it in the way that your camera is letting you? It would be another question. If you look at the Andrew Bush photographs, they're, I can't, let's see. Sorry, I'm gonna
look at the individuals, and there's more in the grid I cropped into for.
Oh, so like that one, right? Like that looks like very unsafe. Like it feels, it definitely, like as a viewer, I'm feeling very unstabilized. So I guess I'm wondering though, are you like, can you get closer? Do you need to get so much of the interior of your car, or can you get a little bit closer? Like, will your camera lens allow for that?
But my first question was about intentionality. Making pictures is not a hard thing to do. Same as, frankly, making paintings or videos. The question how good they are and how transmitted they are to what your intention is. you know, I can come up with 8 different names right now about photographers who work with their kids, and photographers who photograph from inside the house, or the inside the car, or outside of the car, or even work that kind of reminds me what you did earlier with those, like Evidence by Larry Sultan, or, you know, America by Car by Lee Freeman. We can come on and on and on with names and techniques and all those things. But it feels to me that you first need to make a decision. What is your intention?